Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we'll spend some quiet time with Norse mythology, moving slowly through the old stories of gods, giants, sacred trees, distant realms, and the strange, beautiful imaginations of the North. These tales were shaped long before modern books, carried in memory in poetry, and in the long dark seasons of winter. If you enjoy these calm journeys, you're always welcome to like, subscribe, or leave a gentle comment about where you're listening from tonight, or what old subject you'd like to drift into next. For now, let the lights soften a little. Let the room grow still. Imagine the hush of cold air, the flicker of firelight, and the slow turning of stories that once made sense of storms, forests, honor, fear, and fate. We'll begin with the first quiet facts, and let the night carry us from there. Norse mythology comes from the pre-Christian beliefs of the Germanic peoples of Scandinavia, especially in what is now Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and parts of Northern Europe. It was never a single fixed religion with one official scripture. Instead, it lived in stories, poems, rituals, local customs, and remembered traditions that changed from place to place. That is one reason the mythology feels both familiar and elusive. We meet gods whose names survive, yet many details were never written down in the same way a later religion might preserve doctrine. The stories were part of a living world, tied to farm life, seafaring ancestry, seasonal feasts, and the long northern year. In some places, a tale may have been told a little differently from valley to valley, or from one household to another. That flexibility is not a weakness of the tradition, it is part of how it endured. It lived in the voices of people who did not separate myth from landscape or story from daily survival. The word mythology can make these stories sound distant, but for the people who told them, they were part of a practical and sacred understanding of reality. The gods were not merely entertainment. They helped explain the world's order, its danger, and its beauty. In that old landscape, a storm at sea, a sudden frost, or a successful harvest could all carry a sense of divine presence. A traveler might speak of luck, but also of divine favor. A family may have marked the turning of the seasons with quiet ritual offerings or remembered names. The mythology was not only about extraordinary events, it was also about the ordinary texture of life and how that life was held together by unseen powers. Even now, the stories still carry that close human feeling, the sense that the world is larger than what can be measured, but also close enough to be touched in wind, water, and weather. What has reached us today is only a fraction of what was once spoken aloud beside hearths, in halls, and at seasonal gatherings. Many stories were probably never written down at all. Some were forgotten. Others may have survived in fragments, in place names, in customs, or in half-remembered poetic lines. This means the mythology we read now is both rich and incomplete. It is like seeing a northern shoreline through mist. The shape is there, but not every stone is visible. That incompleteness has its own quiet power. It invites careful listening. It also reminds us that older cultures were not static archives. They were living communities, always retelling, trimming, enlarging, and adapting what they knew to suit the moment, the audience, and the season. The sources we have for Norse mythology are mostly later than the myths themselves. Much of what people know today comes from medieval Iceland, where Christian scribes preserved older poems and stories after Scandinavia had converted. This means the mythology reached us through a filter of time, language, and belief. We are not looking at a perfect, untouched relic. We are looking at a carefully preserved echo. That echo can be remarkably clear in places and uncertain in others. Sometimes a text may be preserving a very old tradition. Sometimes it may reflect the interests of the writer, or the tastes of a literary audience, or the influence of Christian thought on how old pagan material was framed. The result is not a simple window into the past, but a layered record where older and newer voices overlap softly. That is especially true of the Eddas, the two great medieval collections that became central to our understanding. The Poetic Edda is a collection of older verse, while the prose Edda was written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century as a guide to poetry and myth. These texts do not simply record old tales, they also interpret them. The poetic Edda preserves voices that feel older, sharper, and more fragmentary, with images that can seem austere and powerful. The prose Edda, by contrast, often explains, arranges, and comments, helping later readers understand the mythic language used by poets. Together they shape much of what modern readers imagine when they think of the Norse gods. Yet even here, caution is needed. What survives is not the whole tradition, but one pathway through it, preserved at a moment when the old beliefs were already receding into memory. Because of this, Norse mythology is partly ancient and partly reconstructed. Scholars compare poems, inscriptions, archaeology, and later retellings to understand what may have been widely known. That careful work leaves room for uncertainty, which is one of the quiet, fascinating things about studying the Old North. A carved image on stone may suggest a god or a scene but not explain it fully. A poem may preserve a ritual phrase or a mythic episode, but not tell us how it was used in daily life. A saga may contain older materials, yet shape them for a literary purpose. So the study of Norse myth often moves gently between certainty and possibility. It asks what may have been remembered, what was emphasized, and what may have changed over time. That open-endedness gives the subject a particular depth. It feels less like reading a fixed script and more like listening for an old refrain through weather and distance. When people think of Norse myth, they often picture thunder, warriors, and a final world-ending battle. Those themes are certainly present, but the mythology is broader and more intimate than that. It also includes love, trickery, grief, magical craft, hospitality, travel, poetry, and the slow moral pressure of fate. The gods are powerful but never simple. They argue, bargain, deceive, endure, and fail. They belong to a world where strength matters, but so does wit. Honor matters, but so does patience. The myths often carry a calm seriousness rather than a single heroic tone. They show divine life as something active and precarious, not effortless. Even the greatest beings move under the shadow of time, loss, and destiny. That is one reason these stories can feel so human, even when they are full of giants, monsters, and otherworldly power. That complexity begins almost immediately with the creation stories, where the universe emerges from cold, darkness, and a great primal emptiness. In the beginning of many Norse creation traditions, there is Ginnungagap, the yawning void. It is not a place in the ordinary sense, but a spacious emptiness between extremes. On one side lay icy Niflheim, a region of cold mist and frozen rivers. On the other lay fiery Muspelheim, a realm of heat and flame. Where these opposites met, life began to stir. This image is striking because it makes creation feel like a meeting of tensions rather than a single command. The world comes not from a gentle garden, but from contact between cold and heat, void and force, stillness and motion. It is a mythic landscape shaped by elemental contrasts that feel almost physical in their intensity. From the melting frost came the primordial giant Ymir, one of the oldest beings in the myths. Alongside him appeared the cow Orthumla, whose milk fed him while she licked salty ice and uncovered another ancestor, Beri. These details are strange, but they are also carefully imagined. The cosmos begins not with polished perfection, but with elemental need, nourishment, and shape emerging from raw matter. There is something very old in this image of life fed by milk, ice, and patience. It suggests that existence itself arises through slow processes, through contact between sustenance and hunger, through the revealing work of time. The mythology does not hurry. Even creation feels vast, cold, and deliberate. Later stories say the gods Odin, Vili, and Ve killed Ymir and fashioned the world from his body. His blood became the seas, his flesh the earth, his bones the mountains, his skull the sky. The myth is both violent and ordered, turning a colossal being into a habitable cosmos. It reflects a worldview in which the world is not gentle, but it can be made meaningful. The image of a world built from a slain primordial being appears in several traditions, but in Norse myth it feels especially stark. The landscape becomes inseparable from sacrifice. The seas are not just waters, the earth is not just ground, everything carries memory. The world is shaped from death, and therefore nothing is entirely innocent or untouched. At the same time, the result is stability, structure, and room for life. The same stories say that from the body of Ymir came the landscape humans know. Even the stars and the enclosing heavens were part of this grand transformation. In that sense, the universe itself is imagined as something shaped from struggle. The myth offers not a scientific explanation, but a poetic one, where every part of the world has an origin that is both physical and symbolic. Mountains stand because of ancient force. The sky holds because it was made from something immense. The world becomes a kind of memory in matter. That is one reason these stories still feel resonant. They imagine nature not as a neutral backdrop, but as an enduring record of first events. A calm part of the Norse worldview is that the world is not static. It is always being formed, threatened, and renewed in cycles of loss and creation. That feeling carries through many of the myths and gives them their deep, quiet gravity. Nothing is fully settled. Even order must be maintained. Even the familiar world rests on older conflict. There is a rhythm to this way of seeing, making, breaking, and making again. It is a worldview suited to a place where winter returns, where the sea can change quickly, where survival depends on attention, and where history is remembered not as a smooth line but as a series of hardened continuities. The center of that cosmic order is Yggdrasil, the great ash tree. It is one of the most enduring symbols in all of Norse myth, a vast tree that connects different realms of existence. Under its branches and within its roots are gods, humans, giants, and hidden beings. Yggdrasil is not merely decorative symbolism. It is a map of the cosmos, a living structure through which life and fate are linked. The tree gives the mythology a shape that is both vertical and rooted. It rises upward, but it also reaches down into hidden depths. In that sense, it gathers together sky, earth, and underworld in one enduring image. The tree is associated with endurance, but it is not untouched by suffering. Beasts gnaw at it. Creatures live within and around it. It is constantly under pressure, just as the world itself is. This makes Yggdrasil a deeply northern image, strong, cold, patient, and always holding against strain. The tree does not shine like a jeweled emblem. It bears weather. It endures damage. It remains standing. That resilience feels especially important in a mythology shaped by cold climates and by an awareness that even great things are vulnerable. The tree's life is not ease but persistence. In the myths, sacred wells lie near its roots, including the Well of Erd where the Norns dwell. Water, tree, and fate are joined together. That combination gives the cosmos a quiet rhythm, as if destiny itself were watered and tended like a living thing. The image is beautiful because it suggests that fate is not merely imposed. It is cared for, attended to, and deepened. The roots drink from hidden waters, and the tree rises from that nourishment. In a symbolic sense, this makes the whole cosmos feel alive in a continuous cycle of dependence. Nothing stands alone. The highest branches depend on the deepest sources. Scholars often note that Yggdrasil may reflect older Indo-European ideas of a world tree, but in Norse myth it takes on a specifically austere character. It is not a bright paradise tree. It is a burdened tree, a tree of endurance, suitable for a world where winter is long and survival is earned. Its greatness is not ornamental. It is structural. It holds the universe together by remaining rooted through pressure. That makes it one of the most powerful images in the mythology, not because it promises comfort, but because it suggests continuity under strain. The tree's imagery also reminds us that Norse mythology was never only about gods in the sky. It was about the structure of existence itself. The people who told these stories looked at forest trees, ash wood, roots, wells, and the changing seasons, and found in them a model for reality. Their myths did not float above the world, they grew out of it. They carried the texture of bark, the depth of water, the weight of winter, and the hush of old ground. That same model helps explain the many realms of the mythic universe, each with its own temperature, temperament, and inhabitants. The Norse cosmos is often described as containing 9 worlds, though the exact arrangement is not consistently explained in the surviving sources. The number 9 appears again and again in Norse tradition, which suggests symbolic importance more than a strict map you could pin to a wall. In the poems and later prose retellings, the worlds are connected by routes, bridges, wells, and paths that do not always behave like ordinary geography. Some realms are familiar to modern audiences, such as Asgard and Midgard, while others remain more shadowed, more fragmentary, and more uncertain. The important thing is not to imagine a neat astronomy chart, but to sense a layered universe full of crossings and thresholds. In that kind of cosmos, distance is not only measured in miles, it is also measured in kind, in fate, in the ability to move from one mode of being to another. Midgard is the world of humans, often understood as the middle enclosure. Even the name suggests a bordered place, something protected and also limited. It is surrounded by danger and linked to the larger cosmic order. In the old imagination, the human world is never fully isolated. Sea, forest, storm, and mountain all press near it. Beyond its edges are forces that are not always hostile, but are always larger than human life. Asgard is the home of the gods, a hall-like realm of power, counsel, and elevated status. It is not always described in consistent detail, yet it feels like a place of gathering, brightness, and deliberate rule. Jotunheim is the land of the giants, those ancient beings who are often opponents, but also relatives, teachers, or rivals of the gods. The giants are not simply monsters, they are often part of the old fabric of the world itself, and so their presence makes the myths feel older than any clear division between good and evil. Below and beyond lie colder or stranger places, including hell, a realm of the dead that is not identical to later ideas of eternal punishment. In many sources, hell is simply where certain dead go, a place of dwelling rather than a place of fiery judgment. These realms were not just settings, they reflected a worldview in which different kinds of being have their own proper places. Crossing between them is meaningful and often difficult, and that difficulty gives the myths much of their quiet tension. One of the best-known gods is Odin, a figure of wisdom, war, magic, and sacrifice. He is not a calm, straightforward father figure, and the stories never let him become entirely simple. He is restless, searching, and often unsettling. In the myths, he seeks knowledge at great cost, as though understanding itself is a dangerous treasure. He gives up an eye for wisdom from the well of Mimir, accepting loss as the price of depth. He hangs himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain the secrets of the runes, entering a liminal state between life and death, suffering and revelation. These acts show that insight in Norse myth is never free. It is earned through ordeal and sometimes through self-wounding. Odin is associated with kingship, poetry, death, and the frenzy of battle, but he also travels in disguise, tests humans, and values hidden understanding. He is one of the most complex gods in the entire mythological record. Because of that, he is often less comforting than he is compelling. He seems to embody the idea that authority without sacrifice is shallow, and that wisdom without risk is incomplete. His 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, are among the most elegant details in the myths. Their names are usually understood as thought and memory, though the precise shades of meaning can be read in more than one way. Each day they fly across the world and return to Odin, bringing him news. The image is beautiful because it makes intelligence feel like a living, traveling process. Knowledge does not sit still. It moves outward, gathers impressions, and comes back. In the old imagination, the mind is something like a bird in flight, crossing wide distances before settling again on a familiar shoulder. The ravens also remind us that memory is a sacred force in myth. To remember is not merely to store facts, it is to hold together what time tries to scatter. That is especially poignant in a tradition preserved through poetry, recitation, and later writing, where remembering itself became a kind of survival. Odin is often accompanied by wolves as well, and his presence is tied to the wildness of the battlefield. The wolf is a fitting companion for a god who stands near death, hunger, and fate. He does not represent peace, but a deeper and more dangerous kind of order. In some stories, he appears as an old wanderer in a broad hat and cloak, asking questions and revealing only pieces of himself. That disguise suggests that wisdom comes indirectly. It may arrive through uncertainty, through testing, through a stranger who does not immediately reveal his name. In that sense, Odin's myths often feel like lessons in attention. They teach that the world is more layered than it first appears, and that the answer you seek may not arrive in the form you expect. A very different divine presence is Thor, the thunder god, whose strength and hammer made him one of the most beloved figures in the Old North. Thor is associated with storms, protection, fertility, and the defense of both gods and humans. His weapon is Mjolnir, the famous hammer that returns to his hand after being thrown. It is a symbol of force, but also of reliability. A hammer that always comes back is not only powerful, it is dependable. It suggests the repeated, steady protection of a divine guardian who can be counted on when the sky darkens. Thor often travels in a chariot drawn by goats, an image that is rugged and almost humble despite his immense power. He fights giants, guards the gods' home, and protects the human world from chaotic forces. Unlike Odin, who seeks hidden wisdom, Thor is more direct. He acts, he endures, he confronts. In the stories, there is something deeply satisfying about that clarity. The threat appears and Thor meets it head-on, yet Thor is not merely a blunt warrior. His myths contain humor, challenge, and vulnerability. He can be outwitted, delayed, and tested. At times, the stories even lean into the comic gap between his immense strength and the strange obstacles placed before him. That balance keeps him alive as a character rather than reducing him to a simple emblem of thunder. He is strong, yes, but he also inhabits a world where strength alone does not solve everything. There is always a bigger pattern, a trickier foe, a more awkward path. This makes Thor feel very human in a mythic way. He is the god who can smash, but who also has to keep showing up and trying again. The popularity of Thor in modern culture often overshadows how old and beloved he already was in earlier traditions. He was not a secondary figure. For many communities, he seems to have been central, especially as a protector in an uncertain world. In a harsh climate where weather and survival mattered deeply, a thunder god with a hammer would not feel abstract. He would feel immediate, useful, and near. The old stories preserve that sense of closeness. Thor is not remote. He arrives in the sound of storm and the crash of protection. He belongs to the practical imagination as much as to the sacred one. Together, Odin and Thor reveal two different kinds of power in Norse myth, the power of knowledge and the power of force. Both are necessary, and both come with cost. Odin's path asks for surrender, sacrifice, and unsettling insight. Thor's path asks for steadiness, courage, and the willingness to stand in the dangerous open. One power sees into things, the other holds things back. In a mythic world, neither is enough on its own. Knowledge without action can drift. Action without wisdom can break what it tries to save. The pairing of these two gods gives the tradition a deep balance, even when the stories themselves are full of tension. Around them stand other gods whose personalities are quieter, stranger, or more difficult to define, and the myths only deepen when those figures enter the hall. Some are remembered in only a few lines. Some appear in stories that may preserve older ritual meanings now only partly understood. The surviving sources are not a complete system, but a scattered inheritance. That incompleteness is part of the atmosphere. It leaves room for silence, and for the sense that much was once known by people whose voices can no longer be heard directly. In that way, the Norse gods do not feel sealed off in the past. They feel like silhouettes at the edge of firelight, half remembered, still waiting to be approached with patience. Loki is one of the most discussed figures in Norse mythology, and also one of the most misunderstood. In the surviving sources, he is clever, changeable, disruptive, and often harmful, but he is not always a simple villain in the modern sense. Sometimes he assists the gods in moments of crisis, and sometimes he is the source of their greatest troubles. His role seems to shift from story to story, which may be part of why he remains so memorable. He stands at the edge of order, testing the strength of the world by unsettling it, as if the myths themselves need a figure who can disturb the settled surface and reveal what lies underneath. There is also something difficult about Loki, because the written sources do not always agree on who he is or how closely he belongs to the other gods. Some poems treat him like a companion of Odin and Thor, while later accounts emphasize his treachery. He can appear witty, even charming, before turning suddenly dangerous. That instability may reflect an older mythic logic in which cunning is not simply evil, but a force that can cut in both directions. In a culture that valued honor, hospitality, and oath-keeping, a figure like Loki would have felt especially unsettling because he keeps crossing the boundary between insider and outsider. Loki is famous for transformation. He appears in animal shapes, uses cunning to solve problems, and shifts from ally to enemy with unsettling ease. This shape-shifting quality makes him feel less like a fixed character and more like a force of instability. In one story, he becomes a mare and gives birth to Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse. That episode is strange and memorable, but it also shows how the myths treat transformation as something serious and real, not merely decorative. The border between human, divine, and animal is never completely sealed in these stories. It can be crossed, however unnervingly, when the narrative requires it. The horse Sleipnir itself is a good example of how Norse myth often joins the marvelous with the functional. Sleipnir is not just unusual for the sake of being unusual. He becomes Odin's great steed, swift enough to move between worlds, including the realm of the dead. So even a bizarre tale about Loki's transformation connects to larger mythic ideas about movement, liminality, and passage. In this way, the story feels both playful and solemn at once, as if something absurd has been preserved because it belongs to a deeper pattern. Loki's children are among the most fearsome beings in the mythic world. With the giantess Angerboda, he fathers Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the world's serpent, and Hel, ruler of the dead. Each of these beings is tied to a boundary, a limit, or a future crisis. They are not random monsters. They embody the pressure points of the cosmic order, the places where the world seems strongest and most fragile at the same time. Myth often uses family to express destiny, and Loki's family is one of the clearest examples of that. Fenrir, in particular, is more than a wild wolf in the usual sense. He is a being whose growth cannot be contained by ordinary means. The gods raise him, fear him, and eventually bind him, but even their efforts only delay what has already been foretold. The image of a wolf that must be restrained with a magical fetter gives the story a tense, almost physical feeling, as though the myth is speaking about the effort required to hold chaos at bay. Jormungandr is equally powerful in a different way. He circles the world and is so large that he bites its own tail, enclosing the earth in a great ring. The image is both beautiful and threatening, like the sea on a moonless night, vast and ungraspable. Hel, meanwhile, presides over the realm named after her, where many of the dead go. She is often described in later texts as stern or pale, but the older material does not reduce her to simple horror. Her realm is part of the necessary architecture of the cosmos. In that sense, Hel is not merely a figure of dread. She is a ruler of separation, receiving those who do not fall in battle and who travel instead to a quieter, colder afterlife. Loki's family is therefore a family of thresholds and endings, each child reflecting a different aspect of limit and consequence. That end-time role becomes central in the prophecy of Ragnarok, where Loki is among the figures who will oppose the gods. He is bound after causing the death of Balder, and his punishment is severe. The stories about this punishment are vivid and spare, the binding, the venom, the endurance of suffering, and the sense that cosmic order has to be maintained through pain. Yet even then, the sources suggest he remains necessary to the structure of fate. In mythology, the dangerous figure often has a purpose beyond simple moral judgment. He may be destructive, but he also belongs to the pattern by which the world moves toward its end. Balder, by contrast, is one of the most luminous figures in the Norse tradition. He is often described as fair, beloved, and radiant, connected with peace and beauty. His death is among the most sorrowful episodes in the myths, and one reason it feels so painful is that the story spends time on protection before it turns to loss. The gods try to protect him by making nearly everything in the world swear not to harm him. Stones, metals, creatures, diseases, and many other things are brought into the oath. It is a remarkably careful act, almost like wrapping a precious object in layer after layer of care. But they overlook one small thing, and that weakness becomes fatal. The story of Balder is quiet in its beginning and devastating in its outcome. It suggests that no amount of power can entirely seal off fate. The myth carries a tender sense of vulnerability, especially because Balder seems so loved by all. His death is not only tragic because a god dies, but because something bright and shared is lost. In some readings, Balder seems to embody not just personal goodness, but a kind of social hope, the possibility of a world made gentler by presence and harmony. When that possibility collapses, the silence around his death feels especially heavy. His mother Frigg is associated with foreknowledge, household power, and devotion. She tries to protect Balder, yet her efforts cannot fully alter what is coming. This makes the myth feel intimate rather than merely cosmic. The failure is not only divine, it is familial. Frigg's sorrow, whether spoken directly or implied in the story, gives the myth a human texture. She is not simply a goddess managing events from above. She is a mother working within the limits of fate, which gives the tale a quiet emotional weight. The story also introduces the mistletoe, a small plant that becomes the hidden instrument of fate. Such a tiny detail can have enormous significance in Norse myth, where destiny often turns on what seems insignificant. That is one of the most haunting features of these stories. The world does not need grand weapons alone to change. Sometimes a fragile plant, a missed precaution, or a small overlooked object becomes the opening through which tragedy enters. The myth seems to suggest that the world is composed of small vulnerabilities as much as large powers. This sensitivity to small causes is one reason the mythology feels believable. Great events emerge from overlooked things, a pattern that reflects both poetry and experience. It is a very human feeling, the sense that life can turn because of one detail forgotten in the right moment. The gods may be immense, but they are not exempt from this principle. That is part of what gives the stories their depth. They are not only tales of grandeur, but also meditations on fragility. Many other gods and goddesses fill the divine household, though they are not all equally well preserved in the texts. Freyja is among the most important. She is linked with love, desire, sorcery, beauty, and sometimes war. She belongs to the Vanir, a different group of gods associated with fertility, wealth, and natural abundance. Freyja's power is rich and complicated, not limited to romance. She is also associated with Seda, a form of magical practice involving fate, knowledge, and altered states. In the surviving sources, she can seem both deeply worldly and intensely mysterious, as though desire and magic were different faces of the same force. Freyja is often one of the most vivid presences in the mythic material because she moves between tenderness and strength so easily. She grieves, desires, bargains, and acts with independence. Some traditions connect her with receiving the fallen dead, which places her near both love and mortality. That combination gives her a layered presence in the imagination. She is not merely beautiful, she is powerful in ways that are socially and spiritually charged, especially in a culture where magic itself could be viewed with awe and suspicion. Her brother Freyr is tied to prosperity, sunshine, peace, and fruitful land. He is one of the clearest divine figures connected with agricultural well-being. In a society where harvest mattered deeply, such a god would be especially significant. He is often imagined with a magic ship and with symbols of fertility and kingship. The world of the crops, the fields, and the changing seasons is central to his meaning. In a northern landscape, where weather could be harsh and growing seasons short, a god like Freya would have represented not only abundance, but relief and continuity. Freya's associations also remind us that Norse mythology is not only about battle and doom. It also includes the quiet hopes of ordinary life: fields ripening, herds thriving, peace in the home, and enough food through the winter. Those concerns are easy to overlook if one focuses only on the dramatic stories of giants and gods, but they are deeply present in the divine world. Freya belongs to that softer side of the tradition, where blessing and survival are intertwined. The Vanir as a group differ from the Aesir, Odin's family of gods, though the distinction is not always neat. The myths tell of a war between the Aesir and Vanir, followed by peace and exchange. This may reflect ancient cultural memory about different divine traditions being brought together. The war itself is not described with complete consistency, which is often the case in mythic traditions preserved through fragments and later retellings. Still, the idea of conflict followed by reconciliation feels significant. It suggests that the pantheon was understood as something that had come together over time, rather than something that had always been uniform. That blending matters because Norse mythology was never a single sealed system. It is a layered inheritance, and its gods often carry traces of older religious worlds. Some figures feel old in one way and newly shaped in another. The surviving texts, written down in medieval Iceland long after the pagan period, preserve only part of a much larger oral tradition. Because of that, scholars often have to work carefully, comparing poetry, prose, archaeology, and later commentary to understand how these figures may once have been worshipped or imagined. The uncertainty is part of the subject itself. The divine hall, therefore, is not empty. It is crowded with power, memory, longing, and unresolved history. In that crowded space, Loki unsettles, Balder illuminates, Frigg protects, Freyja transforms, and Freya blesses. Together they create a mythic world that is not simple or one note, but full of movement and tension. It is a world where beauty can be shadowed by fate, where danger can be necessary, and where even the smallest detail may quietly alter everything. One of the clearest examples of divine exchange in Norse myth is the story of the Aesir and the Vanir making peace after a war. The details are not fully consistent across the surviving sources, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the story so interesting. We do not have one polished official version from antiquity. Instead, we have echoes, summaries, poetic references, and later retellings that seem to preserve a memory of something older than the texts themselves. At some point, the two groups of gods fight, then negotiate, and finally trade hostages, as if divine conflict has to be resolved by the same practical methods used among human communities. In some accounts, the exchange includes important figures who are integrated into the opposing side's society, which may hint at real patterns of cultural blending. Scholars have often wondered whether the myth preserves an older memory of religious fusion, or perhaps the joining of different cults and regional traditions over time. Whatever its origin, the story presents peace not as a simple ending, but as a managed agreement. It suggests that even gods in this tradition are not fixed in one stable order forever. They can be brought into balance after struggle, and that balance itself becomes part of the sacred landscape. The Vanir gods often feel more closely linked to fertility, prosperity, and the health of the land. Their character is softer in some respects, though not weak, and their powers are tied to the rhythms of daily survival: crops, livestock, weather, wealth, and the steady abundance that makes a winter bearable. Njord is one of the most important among them. He is associated with seafaring, wealth, and fair winds, which would have mattered deeply in a maritime world where the sea could provide food, trade, travel, or disaster. For people living close to the coast, The difference between calm water and dangerous weather could shape the entire season. Njord embodies that precarious relationship with the sea. He is often imagined as a god of safe passage and good fortune, not because the sea is ever fully tame, but because it can sometimes be favorable. His children, Freya and Freyja, become among the most beloved deities in the surviving material, and their prominence reflects just how central fertility and prosperity were to the old northern imagination. Freya's association with fertility is especially important, and it reaches beyond simple ideas of reproduction. He is connected to good harvests, peace, and the steady abundance that allows communities to endure winter without fear. In a farming society, abundance is not abstract. It is grain in storage, healthy animals, and enough stability to make it through cold months when the earth lies dormant. Freya is often presented as a god of fruitful land and generous outcome, someone whose favor means continuity rather than mere excitement. He owns a ship called Skidbladnir, which can be folded and carried, a detail that feels almost playful in its ingenuity. He also has a boar called Gullinbursti, whose shining bristles light the way. These images combine practicality with magic in a way that feels deeply Nordic. Useful things are not separated from enchanted things. A ship that can be packed away, or a boar that glows in the dark, belongs to a world where divine power is expressed through objects that serve a purpose. That mixture of miracle and utility gives the mythology a grounded quality. It is not remote fantasy. It is wonder shaped to the scale of travel, labor, and seasonal need. Freya also has a role in stories of kingship and sacred land, and that connection helps explain why he mattered not only as a fertility deity, but as a figure of legitimate rule. Some later rulers were said to descend from him, suggesting that divine abundance and human authority were closely linked in political imagination. A good king was not just a strong fighter. He was expected to preserve peace, maintain prosperity, and ensure that the land remained productive. In that sense, kingship was partly agricultural, partly sacred, and partly moral. The ruler stood between people and the conditions that allowed them to live. If the harvest failed, or if peace broke down, the failure was not only practical. It could also be read as a spiritual disorder. Freya, then, represents a kind of sovereignty that grows from fertility rather than conquest alone. His importance reminds us that ancient ideas of power could be surprisingly gentle, measured in fullness, steadiness, and the quiet confidence of enough. Freyja's emotional and magical range is even broader, and her presence is among the most vivid in the surviving tradition. She is often described as beautiful and desirable, but those qualities do not fully define her, and it would be misleading to reduce her to them. Her role touches desire, grief, magic, death, and power. In some traditions, she cries tears of gold, a striking image that turns sorrow into treasure. The detail is poetic but also emotionally rich. It suggests that grief in myth is not a private weakness. It can be transformed into something luminous, almost sacred. She is said in later retellings to travel with a chariot drawn by cats, a detail that adds softness and mystery to her power. It creates a strange and memorable contrast, a figure of deep emotional force moving through the world in a vehicle pulled by creatures associated with domestic intimacy and independence. Freyja's hall, Sessrumnir, is said to receive some of the dead. This reminds us that death in Norse mythology is not managed by one single divine authority. It is distributed across several realms, several gods, and several possible destinations. Freyja's underworld connection shows that love, loss, beauty, and mortality are intertwined rather than separate. She is not only a goddess of attraction, she is also a keeper of endings, and perhaps of the transformations that follow them. One of the most striking features of Norse myth is that gods frequently make bargains, trade knowledge, or accept terms. Power is not always absolute, and it is certainly not always simple. Even the strongest figures are often forced to negotiate, disguise themselves, borrow aid, or pay a price. This is one reason the mythology feels so human despite its immense scale. Divine life is still shaped by conversation, leverage, obligation, and compromise. A god may win, but only after asking, tricking, or sacrificing something important. Odin's hunger for knowledge is one example, but the pattern appears across many stories. Thor must often rely on force, yet even force has limits. Loki survives by words and wit, but those tools also fail him in the end. The world of the myths does not present power as a smooth or permanent possession. It is unstable, relational, and often costly. That gives the stories a texture of realism beneath the marvels. Cosmic events still depend on social behavior. Agreements matter, promises matter, price matters. Even in the presence of gods, life is negotiated rather than guaranteed. A famous magical item in these stories is Thor's hammer Mjolnir, which appears in myths not only as a weapon but also as a sacred symbol. In the stories, it can crush enemies, defend the gods, and restore order when chaos presses in. But it also has a ritual dimension. It is used in blessing and protection, which broadens its meaning beyond violence. Thor's hammer is not only about destruction, it is about keeping the world intact. Archaeological finds show that hammer pendants were worn widely in the Viking Age, and these tiny objects give a quiet but powerful glimpse into lived belief. People seem to have worn them as expressions of identity, devotion, and perhaps practical protection. In some regions and periods, they may also have functioned in contrast to Christian crosses, especially during times of religious change and competition. That possibility makes the object historically rich. A pendant is small enough to rest against the skin, but large enough in meaning to signal belonging in a changing world. It could be a declaration without words. In that sense, Mjolnir lived not just in epic tales, but on bodies at necklines, in grave, and in everyday life. Myth and material culture meet very clearly here. This is one of the places where mythology and archaeology come together with unusual clarity. A tiny pendant can reveal large shifts in belief, identity, and social pressure. Objects can survive where voices are lost, and they often preserve what formal texts do not. A hammer-shaped charm tells us that Thor was not only a figure in stories recited by poets centuries later. He was also a presence people carried with them, perhaps to feel safer, perhaps to show loyalty, perhaps to keep divine protection close at hand. The archaeological record does not speak in full sentences, but it does speak in patterns. Repeated forms, worn surfaces, burial placement, and regional distribution can all suggest how people understood sacred symbols. The result is a more grounded picture of religion in the past. Gods lived not only in mythic narrative, but in stone, metal, bone, and personal ornament. They were part of the visual and tactile world. This is one reason Norse religion feels so tangible in the surviving evidence. It was not only believed, it was carried, touched, and worn. Similarly, runic inscriptions preserve glimpses of mythic language in everyday settings. Runes were used for communication, memorials, ownership marks, and sometimes magic, which means they occupied several different social spaces at once. They were not simply letters in the modern sense. They belonged to a script that carried cultural prestige and, in some contexts, spiritual weight. A carved inscription might record a name, commemorate the dead, mark property, or invoke protection. The same signs could be practical and symbolic. That flexibility is important. It suggests that writing itself was not separate from belief. Words on wood, bone, or stone were never entirely ordinary. They could endure in weathered surfaces, and that endurance gave them a kind of authority. When runes appear on objects, they remind us that language in the Old North could be both functional and charged with significance. The act of carving a sign was not just mechanical. It was deliberate, sometimes solemn, and sometimes steeped in the hope that the mark would matter beyond the moment of inscription. The myth that Odin gained the runes through sacrifice makes writing itself feel like a sacred discovery. In the old stories, knowledge is rarely free. It is purchased through endurance, risk, or pain. Odin's famous self-sacrifice on the tree transforms the runes from mere symbols into something earned through ordeal. That idea gives literacy a mysterious and elevated status. Writing is not just a tool for keeping track of things. It is an invention brought into the world through a divine act of suffering and insight. This helps explain why poetry mattered so deeply in the Old North. If language itself is powerful, then the skilled use of language becomes a form of craft with spiritual overtones. The runes sit within that wider atmosphere, where signs are never entirely neutral and knowledge has a sacred cost. Skaldic poetry, in particular, was a refined and demanding art. It was not casual verse, nor was it simply decorative speech. It relied on complex meter, intricate patterning, kennings, and dense, elusive language. A sea could be called a whale road, a battle a storm of swords, a ship a wave rider. These expressions may sound strange at first, but they were part of a learned tradition in which memory, performance, and craftsmanship were inseparable. To compose or understand skaldic verse required attention. It invited the listener into a world of layered meanings, where words pointed beyond themselves. The poetry could celebrate kings, preserve deeds, satirize enemies, or memorialize the dead. It could be formal and difficult, but also brilliant in its compression. Such poetry was a way of holding history in the mind while shaping it aesthetically. The poets were not merely entertainers. They were custodians of cultural memory. When medieval authors preserved these forms, they were preserving an art that had already lived for generations in spoken performance. By the time the surviving manuscripts were written down, the culture that produced the poems had already changed significantly, and in some cases the texts may have been filtered through Christian literacy and later interpretation. That does not make them less valuable. It makes them more complex. What survives is a record of transmission, not a raw snapshot. The poems were not casual descriptions of myth. They were cultivated acts of remembrance, passed from mouth to ear, and then from page to page. Their language is often compressed because it was made to be heard in a setting where every phrase could carry more than one meaning. A hall full of listeners, a poet standing in lamplight, the sound of rhythm moving through silence. These are the conditions that gave the verse life. The poems ask the listener to slow down, to hold images in the mind, and to let meaning unfold gradually. That poetic world, in turn, helps explain why some of the myths feel so compressed and vivid. They were meant to be spoken with rhythm, care, and a listening room full of silence. A single line could carry a whole network of associations, and a brief reference could awaken an older story already known to the audience. In that way, Norse myth often works like memory itself. It is partial, indirect, and rich with implication. It does not always explain everything. Instead, it leaves space for recognition, for repeated hearing, and for the soft unfolding of familiar figures in new contexts. That quality makes the surviving material especially suited to contemplative listening. The stories do not hurry. They arrive in fragments, images, and remembered names, and the listener is invited to stay with them. The runes are among the most recognizable features of the northern world, and they occupy a curious place between ordinary writing and something older, stranger, and more ceremonial. In historical terms, they were an alphabet used across parts of the Germanic-speaking world, carved into wood, stone, bone, and metal. In legend, however, they are never just letters. They are often treated as signs that carry weight beyond their shapes, as though each mark held a small portion of hidden order. According to the mythic account most often told, Odin did not simply learn the runes from another god or discover them in a peaceful classroom of wisdom. He won them through ordeal. Hanging on Yggdrasil, the great world tree, he endured pain, hunger, exposure, and a kind of deliberate loneliness that brought him close to death. The image is severe but also deeply symbolic. Knowledge is not offered cheaply. It must be suffered for, and the one who seeks it must be willing to cross a threshold of comfort. This story gives language a sacred and demanding quality. It suggests that words are not merely tools for naming things, They are part of a deeper structure in the universe, something that can reveal power if approached with enough seriousness. In some later retellings and interpretations, runes become linked with magic, divination, and hidden meaning. Whether every such association is ancient in exactly the same form is difficult to prove, but the feeling around them is unmistakable. Runes seem to belong to a world where speech and fate stand close together. The Old North was also an oral culture in a profound sense. Long before modern habits of reading and writing became normal, memory had to do the work of preserving whole bodies of tradition. Poems, family histories, laws, insults, praise, settlement stories, and heroic episodes all depended on people who could hold them in mind and recite them accurately enough to keep them alive. This made trained speakers, poets, and storytellers especially important. They were not simply entertainers at the edge of society, they were custodians of continuity. A skilled poet could preserve a line of descent, remember a feud, praise a ruler, or shape a communal memory into something worth repeating. In a world where a story might travel from hall to hall, coast to coast, and generation to generation, the person who knew how to tell it well carried real cultural authority. The voice mattered, the rhythm mattered. Even the pauses mattered because they helped memory settle into the body. This oral tradition also helps explain why Norse myth often survives in fragments rather than in a single smooth narrative. A tale might appear in one poem, echo in another, and be hinted at in a saga centuries later. Some parts are vivid and detailed, while others are brief or uncertain. That does not make the mythology weak. In a way, it makes it feel more lived in. Like weathered stone, it shows the marks of time. There is a particular beauty in this brokenness. The surviving stories are not always complete, but they are rarely dull. They have the texture of things that were spoken aloud by firelight, repeated in winter, and remembered by people who expected their audience to know the background already. As a result, the myths feel like glimpses into a larger world just beyond the edge of what survives. One of the most famous and moving stories in the surviving material is the death of Balder. It is often remembered not only because it is tragic, but because it is tragically careful. The gods sense that danger is approaching, and Frigg, Balder's mother, tries to prevent any harm by taking oaths from nearly everything in the world. Fire, water, metal, stone, sickness, beasts, birds, and plants are all made to promise that they will not hurt him. The effort is tender, almost domestic in its protective instinct. It feels like a mother trying to make the entire world safe for her child. Only mistletoe is overlooked. In some versions, it is dismissed because it is young, small, or harmless-looking. That tiny omission becomes catastrophic. Loki, always alert to the weak point in a situation, uses it to bring about Balder's death. The blow itself is often framed as accidental in the manner of its delivery, but never accidental in the moral sense. The story has the weight of something unavoidable once the hidden flaw is in place. Balder's death then opens into a vast sorrow. The grief of the gods is immediate and communal, but it also feels cosmic. The loss is not only personal, it seems to mark a fault line in the world's structure. In many retellings, the event is understood as one of the clearest signs that the age of the gods is already moving toward decline. It is one of those myths that seems to stand half in the present and half in the future, as if the death of one radiant figure quietly announces the fading of a whole order. What gives the Balder story its power is partly its atmosphere. There is no great battlefield at the center of it, no thunderous clash of armies. Instead, the tale unfolds in a space of trust, ritual, and ordinary vulnerability. The gods are gathered together. They think they have made the world safe. They have not. That contrast makes the tragedy feel intimate in a particularly Norse way, where the smallest lapse can carry enormous consequences. The myth also illuminates a recurring Norse idea that fate cannot always be escaped, even by divine beings. It would be misleading to describe this simply as a crude belief that nothing can ever change. The older worldview seems subtler than that. Knowledge still matters, warning still matters, action still matters. Yet there remains a stern sense that some things move toward fulfillment with a pressure that cannot be fully stopped. To know what is coming is not always to prevent it. That solemn understanding of destiny is reflected in the beings most closely associated with fate, the Norns. They are sometimes compared to the Greek fates, though such comparisons should be handled carefully. The Norns are not always presented in exactly the same way across the sources, and the tradition is not as neatly organized as later summaries sometimes make it seem. Still, they stand near the roots of Yggdrasil and are closely tied to the Well of Erd, where the past gathers into the living structure of the world. Their names are often connected, in modern explanation, with past, present, and future, though the surviving texts do not always force them into a simple triad. They are more like ancient shapers of destiny than abstract symbols. They are sometimes imagined as measuring, weaving, or marking out the length of a life. The imagery is calm, but not comforting in any simple way. A thread that is measured carefully can still be cut. A life that is beautifully woven can still be limited. This is one reason the Norse cosmos feels so morally serious. It is not a universe of random chaos, nor is it a universe where goodness guarantees safety. Instead, it is a world in which things matter because they have consequence. Promises matter, omissions matter, memory matters. Even the smallest overlooked detail, like a harmless plant left out of an oath, can change the course of divine history. The stories insist on this with a quiet force. The Well of Erd is one of the most beautiful images in the mythology. Beside it, the roots of Yggdrasil are nourished, and the tree continues to stand. Water from the well sustains what would otherwise dry out and fail. The Norns care for this place, and in doing so they become part of the ongoing maintenance of the cosmos. The world is not presented as a machine that runs by itself. It requires tending. That idea of tending is deeply moving. It suggests that survival is not passive. It is active, repeated, and often invisible. The cosmos endures because something keeps attending to it. In that sense, the mythology honors the quiet labor behind continuity. It is a fitting image for a culture that valued memory, repetition, and careful preservation. The same balance between endurance and fragility appears in the treatment of sacred animals. Wolves, ravens, horses, boars, and serpents recur throughout the myths, each carrying its own symbolic force. These are not merely background creatures moving through the frame. They are participants in the spiritual atmosphere of the stories. They can be companions, warnings, gifts, threats, or expressions of divine presence. Ravens, especially, are often linked with Odin as birds of thought and memory circling above the world. Wolves can suggest danger, hunger, battle, or the wild edge beyond settled life. Horses move between worlds with a kind of grave elegance, carrying gods, dead warriors, or ritual associations. Boars are tied to strength, fertility, and ceremonial display. Serpents may be feared, but they also belong to the deep, ancient imagery of earth and boundary. Together, these animals help create a mythology that feels alive to movement, instinct, and omen. In many cases, the sources do not explain every symbolic layer in a single authoritative way. That uncertainty is part of the atmosphere. The old traditions were not always systematized by the people who told them. A creature might be powerful in one tale, ominous in another, and simply present in a third. Yet the repetition itself creates meaning. Over time, the animals become familiar shapes in the mythic landscape, as recognizable as hills or standing stones. This broader imaginative world is held together by runes, poems, gods, fate keepers, and animals, all moving through a culture where knowledge was carried by word, sign, and memory. It is a world that does not rush. It listens. It watches. It allows the dark to gather around meaning without trying to over-explain it. And because of that, even the oldest stories can still feel strangely near, as though they are resting quietly just beyond the edge of sleep. Animals play a deep role in Norse mythology, and they are never just background decoration. They are active presences in the stories, carrying practical meaning, emotional force, and symbolic weight all at once. In a world shaped by farms, hunting, weather, travel, and seasonal danger, animals were close companions to daily life. It makes sense that they would also become companions of the gods. Norse myth often treats them as if they belong to the borderland between nature and mind, between instinct and message, between the visible world and something just beyond it. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, are perhaps the most famous of all. Their names are usually understood as thought and memory, and that alone gives them a special quietness. They are not simply birds in the usual sense, but extensions of awareness. Each day they fly across the world and then return to Odin, bringing news of what they have seen. The image is striking because it makes intelligence feel animal and mobile, as if thought itself had wings. Ravens were common in northern landscapes, gathering near fields, roads, battle sites, and shorelines. People would have known their black shape well, watchful, adaptable, and slightly eerie in their confidence. That everyday familiarity likely deepened the mythic effect. In the poems, the ravens become more than messengers. They become part of Odin's own reach, helping him know what lies far away without ever leaving his seat. Wolves are more dangerous and more ambiguous. In later memory, they can seem like pure symbols of threat, but the myths do not simplify them that neatly. Odin is associated with wolves, and his warrior side sometimes carries wolf-like imagery. At the same time, Fenrir, his son, is the great wolf of disaster and the apocalypse. That contrast matters. Wolves in the Old North could represent ferocity, predation, winter pressure, and the hard edge of wilderness. They were creatures of risk, but also of strength, endurance, and a kind of proud independence. Norse literature often leaves room for admiration beside fear. A wolf is not good in a soft or domestic sense, but it is powerful, alert, and difficult to ignore. In myth, that makes it suitable for the world of gods, where force is never far from wisdom. Thor's goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjoster, are another memorable pair, and they bring a different mood. Where ravens feel intelligent and wolves feel dangerous, the goats feel sturdy, rhythmic, and almost homely, even though their story is still strange. They pull Thor's chariot across the sky, linking him to motion, thunder, and sudden arrival. Their hooves and horns fit the image of rough travel, of movement over uneven ground. In one well-known story, Thor kills and eats them, then restores them through magic, provided that their bones remain intact. It is an unsettling tale, but also a very old sort of tale, full of the sense that life can be broken apart and made whole again under divine conditions. The story seems to touch on sacrificial thinking, feast culture, and the mystery of renewal. A meal is not simply consumption here. It belongs to a sacred cycle in which ending and return are folded together. Boars are especially important in the Vanya tradition, and they bring a warmer, more fertile mood into the mythology. Freya's boar Gullinbursti shines in the dark, its golden bristles casting light as it runs. The image is beautiful and strangely gentle, even though a boar is also a forceful animal with a heavy body and a powerful charge. Boars in northern life were associated with earthiness, abundance, and feasting. They fit especially well with ideas of seasonal plenty, cultivated land, and ritual celebration. In a culture that depended so closely on the rhythms of agriculture and survival, the boar could symbolize more than meat or strength. It could suggest the promise that the land will yield, that winter will pass, that a household or community may endure. When mythology gives such an animal to a god of prosperity, it makes that promise luminous. Horses also matter a great deal, both in practical life and in mythic imagination. In the historical North, horses were not only useful animals, but markers of travel, status, and connection. They carried people across distance, helped with labor, and appeared in ceremony and burial alike. Myth enlarges that importance into something cosmic. Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, is one of the most unusual creatures in the entire mythic record. Its many legs may symbolize speed, supernatural travel, or the ability to cross thresholds that ordinary beings cannot cross. Sleipnir is not simply a fast horse. It is a horse that seems designed for moving between worlds. Odin rides it into hidden places, including realms of the dead and the deep unknown. That quality gives the horse an almost dreamlike significance. Movement is no longer just travel from one place to another. It becomes passage through layers of reality. The horse becomes a vehicle for divine crossing, a living answer to the question of how a god goes where others cannot. The horse in Norse culture therefore holds two truths at once. It is a real working animal, tied to practical life, and it is also elevated in myth into a being of liminal force. In burial mounds, image stones, and later legend, horses often stand near ideas of honor and transition. Mythology does not separate the ordinary from the sacred as sharply as modern thought sometimes does. Instead, it allows a well-known creature from daily life to become the bearer of mystery. That is one of the quiet strengths of these stories. They begin with the world people knew and then let that world open outward. Serpents or dragons appear in several forms as well, and they carry a colder kind of symbolic pressure. Jormungandr, the world serpent, encircles the earth and waits at the edge of the sea. The image is vast and unsettling. A serpent that wraps around the world suggests enclosure, tension, and latent danger. It also suggests boundaries. Serpents in myth often belong to the places where categories blur, between land and water, life and death, above and below, seen and hidden. They are ancient creatures, stripped of comfort, moving with silent persistence. In Norse myth, Jormungandr embodies the scale of the world's limits. He is not just a beast to be fought. He is a force that marks how large and constrained reality can feel. The dragon Fafnir belongs to a different mythic cycle, more heroic than cosmic, but equally important. In the Volsung material, he is transformed by greed and becomes a dragon guarding treasure. This transformation is one of the great images in the tradition because it gives monstrous form to moral corruption. Fafnir is not merely a dangerous creature in the abstract. He is a being shaped by possessiveness, hoarding, and the hardening of desire. The story connects treasure with ruin, showing how wealth can become poisonous when it dominates the mind. It is also one of the myths that later fed medieval heroic literature and, much later, modern fantasy. But in its older form, the tale feels less like spectacle and more like warning. Treasure can sit in a hoard like a sleeping fire, and the one who guards it may become less than human in the guarding. Even smaller animals can carry mythic weight, especially when they appear near Yggdrasil, the great world tree. Squirrels, hawks, and other creatures move along its branches and bark, carrying messages or creating tension. Ratatoskr, the squirrel most often remembered, is a good example. He runs up and down the tree, bearing words between the eagle at the top and the serpent below. The image has a restless, almost comic energy, but it also reveals how the Norse cosmos is structured through communication and friction. Even tiny creatures can help connect distant parts of existence. A mythic world does not need only giants and gods to feel alive. It needs motion at many scales. It needs small crossings, repeated errands, and the feeling that nothing is entirely isolated from anything else. This helps explain why Norse mythology feels so vivid and inhabited. It is not a sterile system of abstract symbols arranged in a tidy pattern. It is a crowded ecological imagination. The forest, the hall, the sea, and the sky all share the same symbolic weather. Creatures move through them, and those movements matter. The world is full of watching, carrying, feeding, hunting, and crossing. That texture makes the mythology feel lived in. It does not hover above experience, it grows from it. That weather becomes especially intense when the gods travel beyond their own home and enter the lands of giants, where strength meets resistance, and wisdom is often tested in disguise. The giants, or Jötnar, are among the most important and misunderstood beings in Norse mythology. They are often presented in simplified retellings as if they were just enemies, but the relationship between gods and giants is much more complicated than that. Many gods have giant ancestry. Some giants are wise, some ancient, some beautiful, and some terrifying. They are not a single moral category. Instead, they represent primordial force, natural vastness, and the untamed world beyond social order. In that sense, they are both outside the community and deeply entangled with its origins. The myths repeatedly return to the fact that the gods themselves are not wholly separate from giant kinship. The border between divine and monstrous is never absolute. Jotunheim is their realm, a place imagined as distant, cold, and large in scale. But the giants do not merely stay there. They cross constantly into divine and human affairs. Sometimes they threaten, sometimes they test, sometimes they host, bargain, or instruct. Their presence reminds us that the world is not fully domesticated, no matter how carefully the gods build halls or set boundaries. Even the godly order rests beside a wildness it cannot erase. The giants are part of the condition of reality itself, ancient, resistant, and impossible to reduce to simple chaos. Rivalry with the giants also creates many of the best-known mythic adventures. Thor's journeys often lead him into giant territory, where he confronts deception, strength, and impossible challenges. These episodes are not just action scenes, they are symbolic encounters with the limits of divine power. Thor is strong, but the stories continually place him in situations where strength alone is not enough. He must endure embarrassment, trickery, hunger, travel, or cunning opposition. That pattern gives the tales their peculiar charm. The gods are mighty, but they are not exempt from difficulty. Their greatness is measured partly by the scale of what they must face. In some stories, giants are hosts, teachers, or keepers of knowledge. Odin in particular is drawn toward hidden wisdom, and he often seeks it from giant beings. That detail is important because it prevents the mythology from becoming too simple. The wild is threatening, yes, but it is also a source of insight. Ancient memory, poetic knowledge, and cosmic perspective can all come from the edge of the civilized world. Wisdom in this tradition is not owned exclusively by the gods. It must sometimes be won from those who stand outside them. That ambiguity extends naturally to the concept of hospitality. In the Old North, hospitality mattered greatly. To receive a guest properly was a social duty, and failing to do so could bring shame or danger. Myth reflects this importance again and again. Many stories begin with travel, arrival, and the testing of welcome. A stranger is received, watched, fed, questioned, or challenged. Sometimes the outcome is generosity. Sometimes it is tension, but the structure itself matters. The divine and heroic worlds are full of meals, halls, and negotiations, because those are the spaces where social life becomes visible and where character is revealed. The hall itself is one of the most important settings in Norse culture. A hall was not only a building, it was a center of feasting, loyalty, leadership, and speech. It was where people gathered in winter, where gifts were exchanged, where poetry could be heard, where status was displayed, and where community was made tangible through shared food and firelight. Mythic action often takes place in halls because halls are where order gathers itself into a visible shape. Warriors sit there, kings dispense treasure, poets speak, gods receive visitors. The hall is one of the great human inventions of the North, and mythology treats it as a sacred social form. Valhalla is the best-known hall of all, a place associated with Odin and slain warriors. It is imagined as a great roofed space where the dead who fell in battle may gather. The image has long fascinated later readers, but it should not be taken as the whole of Norse afterlife thought. It is one important destination among several. Not all dead go there, and the myths do not suggest that they do. That variety matters. It means the dead are not all imagined through a single moral framework. Their destinations depend on circumstance, fate, and perhaps local tradition. Valhalla is therefore grand but not universal. Some dead go to hell, a realm that is often misunderstood in modern retellings. Hell is not simply a place of punishment. It is a shadowed home for many who die of illness, age, or ordinary fate. The name itself is connected with the realm and its ruler, and later imagination often made the place seem darker than the surviving material requires. Yet even there, the emphasis is not always on torment. It is on a different kind of dwelling, a realm removed from brightness but not necessarily defined by moral failure. Norse belief about the dead is broader, more varied, and more local than later simplifications suggest. Death does not flatten everyone into the same story. It distributes them into different forms of continued presence. The presence of halls, feasts, and final resting places reveals how deeply social the mythology is. Even death is imagined through the language of gathering and reception. The dead are not only lost, they are received somewhere. They enter another house, another seat, another climate of being. This is part of what gives the myths their quiet warmth, even when the subject is serious. Life continues to be understood through relationship, company, and place. From here, the stories begin to move toward heroes, treasure, and the long memory of fate that shadows kings as well as gods. Valhalla is one of the most famous images in Norse mythology, but in modern retellings it is often flattened into a simple idea of paradise for warriors. In the older imagination, it is more specific and more solemn than that. Valhalla is Odin's hall, a place associated with some of those who die in battle, especially the warriors chosen by the Valkyries. The hall is described in ways that make it feel immense and alive: roofs gleaming, walls crowded, benches filled, weapons near at hand. It is not a place of quiet retirement. It is a place of gathering, training, and expectation. The chosen dead eat, drink, and prepare, not because they have escaped struggle, but because they are being assembled for the struggle that remains. This matters because it shows how Norse mythology often treats death as a threshold rather than an ending. The afterlife is not always a vague reward or punishment. It can be tied to purpose, memory, and obligation. Valhalla reflects a warrior culture, but it is not a complete statement of that culture. The mythology does not suggest that only combat matters or that every human life is measured by violence. Instead, it presents battle as one powerful form of honor among others, a path that connects mortal life to divine attention. The atmosphere of Valhalla is therefore both celebratory and austere. It is bright, but it is also preparatory. Its feast is shadowed by the coming end of the world. The Valkyries themselves are among the most enduring figures in the tradition, partly because they stand at that same edge between beauty and severity, life and death. Their name means something like choosers of the slain, and that basic meaning remains central even though the literary images vary widely. In some texts, they are martial women who move among battlefields with a terrible authority. In others, they are more individualized characters, woven into heroic stories and royal legends. Later art often makes them into shining armored maidens, but the older material is less uniform and sometimes more uncanny. They are not only attendants, they are selectors. They decide who will be taken from the field and carried onward. That role gives them a kind of ritual seriousness. They are linked with fate, not in a casual or decorative sense, but in the deep mythic sense that events are being gathered and directed by powers beyond ordinary sight. In battle scenes, the Valkyries are not simply observing human bravery. They are participating in the order behind it. Their presence suggests that no death on the field is entirely random. Even so, the mythology does not present them as cold abstractions. Their stories can be personal, even intimate, and that mixture is part of their fascination. They are figures who move between thunder and stillness, the clang of weapons and the quiet of the hall. The Valkyries also help explain one of the mythology's larger emotional patterns, the idea that a death can be both an ending and a passage. The dead warrior is not erased, he is carried. He enters another arrangement of time, another kind of waiting. In that sense, the Valkyries bridge not only battle and afterlife, but also human courage and divine design. Their role makes the mythic world feel carefully layered, as though every visible event has a deeper, hidden structure beneath it. Outside the battle imagery, Norse mythology contains many stories of journeys, challenges, and difficult crossings. Thor's adventures are especially rich in this respect. and they often feel like travel narratives as much as divine exploits. He moves across wide landscapes with companions, sometimes Loki, sometimes servants or retainers, and he encounters giants, magical disguises, strange architecture, and deceptive hospitality. There is a road-like rhythm to these stories. One place leads to another. A hall may seem welcoming and then reveal itself as a trap. A journey begins in familiarity and ends in confusion. The world appears enormous, cold, and irregular, with long distances between points of certainty. Thor himself is often imagined as direct and forceful, but his stories are not always straightforward triumphs. He can be tested, delayed, mocked, or misled. That is part of what makes the tales memorable. He is not a figure who simply stands above danger. He enters it. He wrestles with the strange logic of the worlds beyond human settlement. Mountains, storms, rivers, and giant halls are all stages for his encounters. The stories preserve a feeling of movement through dangerous space, where intelligence matters as much as strength, and where hospitality can conceal hostility. One especially famous episode involves Thor visiting the giant king Utgar the Loki, a figure whose very name invites confusion. In that story, Thor and his companions are drawn into a sequence of contests that seem to end in failure or humiliation. Thor appears to lose. His companions also seem outmatched. Yet the end of the tale reveals that much of what happened was illusory, shaped by enchantment or deceptive perception. The feats were not what they seemed. Thor did not fail in the simple sense, but he was made to confront the limits of direct force. The story is subtle because it does not reduce him to a fool. Instead, it demonstrates that strength alone cannot penetrate every illusion. This kind of narrative is common in Norse myth. Surface reality is often incomplete. What looks obvious may be only the outer layer of a more complicated truth. The Old Norse values courage, but it does not praise bluntness without reserve. There is an appreciation for cunning, for perspective, and for recognizing when appearances have been carefully arranged. Even Thor, the great hammer-bearing protector, must sometimes learn that the world can mislead the eye and the body at once. The resulting mood is not cynical. It is instructive, almost patient. Wisdom begins where assumption ends. That same tension between appearance and reality also shapes many treasure stories, especially those connected to the Völsung cycle and the dragon Fafnir. Here the mythology shifts from the company of gods to the tragic world of heroic humans, yet the atmosphere remains saturated with fate. The dragon slayer Sigurd stands at the center of this material. He is often presented as one of the great heroes of the Germanic world, brave, gifted, and marked by the strange authority that only exceptional figures seem to carry. His story includes supernatural knowledge, ominous warnings, and the kind of success that never remains simple for long. Fafnir's treasure is one of the most famous cursed hoards in legend. Whether described as cursed in a strict sense or simply destructive in effect, it is never merely wealth. The gold carries consequence. It attracts betrayal, binds people to oaths, and leaves ruin in its wake. This is a deeply Norse idea in feeling, even when the details vary by source. Treasure is beautiful, but it is not morally neutral. It comes with weight. It alters relationships. It can turn affection into suspicion and ambition into doom. The hoard beneath a dragon is therefore not just an object of greed. It is a compressed symbol of the way desire can narrow the world. Sigurd's encounter with Fafnir is also one of the mythological tradition's great moments of transformation. The dragon slayer gains more than victory. He gains knowledge, and that knowledge is inseparable from danger. In some versions, he understands the speech of birds after tasting the dragon's blood, or he receives warnings that move him toward his fate. The details vary, as they often do in oral and semi-oral traditions, but the shape of the story remains powerful. Knowledge arrives through risk. Insight is purchased at a cost. The hero is enlarged by experience, but he is also carried forward into loss. What gives the Sigurd material such lasting force is its emotional range. It is not only about combat or marvels. It includes love, promise, warning, ambition, and betrayal. It moves through intimate scenes as well as public ones. People remember names, exchange gifts, make pledges, and break them. The tragedy feels human even when the scale is legendary. That blend of heroic grandeur and personal sorrow is one reason the cycle remained so important in later literature. It offered not just adventure, but a way to think about honor and vulnerability at the same time. Brynhild, often associated with Valkyrie imagery or with royal and heroic legend, adds another layer of solemnity to that story world. She is a figure of strength and knowledge, but also of constraint. Her identity is shaped by vows, interventions, and the demands of fate. In some traditions, she is a shield maiden type. In others, she is more securely a tragic noblewoman whose role has been transformed by mythic memory. Whatever the exact version, she is never merely decorative. She is alert, proud, and bound to a difficult logic of honor. Her relationship with Sigurd is among the most emotionally charged in the cycle, and it reveals how quickly personal feeling can become entangled with oath, rank, and destiny. The importance of Brynhild in the broader tradition is partly that she shows how Norse myth handles passion. Love is rarely simple or safe. It does not exist outside the pressures of reputation and obligation. In this world, a private attachment can become a public disaster. That does not mean the stories are cold. On the contrary, they are often intensely feeling, but the feeling unfolds within a culture of promises and remembered words. The result is tragedy of a distinctly northern kind, restrained on the surface but deeply wounded through with loss. One of the most important things to remember about Norse mythology is that it was never only religious material in the narrow sense. It also functioned as a cultural language for values, especially honor, memory, leadership, kinship, and grief. The myths and heroic poems preserved models of conduct, but they also preserved the emotional atmosphere of social life. They told people how to remember the dead, how to speak in a hall, how to receive a guest, how to react to insult, and how to understand the consequences of praise or shame. In this way, mythology was not separate from daily life. It helped organize it. That is why the settings of feasts and courts matter so much. In Norse literature, speech has a real weight. A spoken word can establish a bond, announce a claim, preserve a reputation, or destroy one. Banquet halls are not just places of food and drink. They are places where identity is publicly maintained. Who sits where, who is welcomed, who speaks first, who keeps silent, and who remembers what was said can all matter enormously. The social world is therefore very close to the emotional world. Nothing is fully private for long. Everything is witnessed, whether by kin, retainers, rivals, or the gods themselves. This witness gives the mythology its particular pressure. Actions do not disappear. Oaths remain active. Gifts create obligations. Insults echo forward. A person may be gone, but the meaning of what they did lingers in the mouths of others. The stories preserve that lingering quality with unusual care. Even when a tale is fantastic, its emotional logic often feels realistic in a quiet, almost documentary way. The hall is warm, but it can become tense. The feast is bright, but memory sits among the benches. As these traditions move toward their larger endings, that sense of being observed becomes even more significant. The old stories do not approach catastrophe with panic. They approach it with a strange stillness, as though the world has long known what is coming. That quiet awareness, carried through hall, battlefield, and heroic memory, will matter again when the mythology turns fully toward the end of the gods and the calm, terrible dignity of Ragnarok. Ragnarok is the Norse end-time event, and it stands as one of the most powerful images of cosmic ending in world literature. The old poems do not present it as a sudden collapse with no warning. Instead, they unfold it like a long, dark pressure building across the world. There are signs before the final breaking. The sun grows dim, the seas stir, the dead begin to move, oaths fail, kinship weakens. Even the boundaries that once seemed firm between gods, giants, monsters, and mortals begin to blur. The whole atmosphere of the myth is heavy with inevitability, as if the world itself has already begun to lean toward its final season. What makes Ragnarok especially compelling is that it is not pure annihilation. The old sources hold destruction and renewal together in the same vision. Fires sweep across the earth, and battle consumes the great powers of the world, yet the stories still allow for survival. A few gods endure. The earth rises again from the waters. Hidden life remains in shelter, waiting out the storm. In this way, Ragnarok is not only about the end of one order, but about the persistence of life after overwhelming loss. It carries a bleakness that is never entirely without hope. The tone is severe but not empty. Fenrir, the great wolf, is among the most fearsome figures in that final conflict. His presence begins long before the end, when the gods become frightened of his growing strength and choose to bind him with magical force. That act itself says much about the world of the myths. Power is not merely admired, it is also feared, contained, and delayed. The prophecy that Fenrir will one day break free gives his story a slow, inevitable tension. When the time comes, he is not simply a monster appearing from nowhere. He is a force long restrained, reaching the point foretold for him from the beginning. The image of Fenrir devouring Odin is one of the most striking moments in the whole cycle, not because it is sensational alone, but because it feels like destiny finally taking shape. Jormungandr, the world's serpent, also rises in the last battle, and its conflict with Thor is one of the most famous scenes in the mythic tradition. In many retellings, the serpent and the thunder god are locked in a struggle so immense that it seems to shake the order of the world itself. Thor manages to strike the serpent, but he does not escape its poison, and the two fall together. That mutual destruction gives the scene a precise kind of symmetry. Neither side triumphs cleanly, neither can remain untouched. The myth seems to suggest that certain powers are simply too deeply matched for one to survive the other without cost. The serpent coils around the world, and the god who protects the world can defeat it only by giving his own life in return. Loki's role at Ragnarok adds another layer of collapse to the story. Earlier traditions often portray him as a trickster, a complicated figure who shifts between helper and disruptor, sometimes useful and sometimes dangerous. After his role in Baldur's death, he is bound as punishment, and that image of restraint is one of the most memorable in the mythic corpus. Yet the binding does not end his influence. When Ragnarok comes, Loki breaks free and joins the enemies of the gods. His return is not random. It completes a pattern of broken trust, delayed vengeance, and unresolved disorder. In the Norse imagination, chaos is not a foreign invasion from outside history. It is something history itself must eventually face when all its tensions come due. One of the most haunting details associated with Ragnarok is the wolf or wolves that chase the sun and moon, depending on the version and the poem. These celestial hunters turn the sky into a scene of pursuit and fear. The heavens are not distant and still. They are animated by threat. The moon does not simply travel across the night, it can be pursued. The sun does not merely shine, it can be hunted. This gives the cosmos a strange intimacy, as though the highest bodies in the sky are as vulnerable as any earthly creature. It is a vivid poetic way of saying that even the most reliable patterns can be threatened, and that darkness is always waiting at the edge of light. Yet after the fires, after the battle, after the collapse of the old order, the surviving world is not empty. The earth rises again from the sea, refreshed and green. Some gods remain or return. In certain versions, Baldur is associated with the renewed age, a sign that peace can come after catastrophe. The surviving human pair, often named as Lif and Lifthrasir, are said to endure hidden in a place of shelter, preserved through the destruction to repopulate the world. Scholars have long noted that the details vary between sources and that the surviving world may be understood differently in different poems or retellings. Still, the essential pattern remains stable enough to matter. The old stories do not end with nothingness. They end with the stubborn persistence of life. This makes Ragnarok feel less like a modern apocalypse and more like a myth of cyclical renewal. It does not deny devastation. It gives devastation its full weight. But it also remembers the turning of seasons, the return of growth, the way ice gives way to water and then to leaf. In the northern world, winter can seem endless while it lasts, and the myths reflect that lived experience. They do not speak lightly about renewal. They speak of it as something hard-won, something that comes only after the most severe loss. That is part of why the ending remains so moving. It is not cheerful. It is sober and therefore believable within the mythic logic. The surviving gods are often linked in later interpretive tradition with a more peaceful future, sometimes imagined as a return of Balder and Herd after the destruction, or as a new age in which conflict is reduced and the world is restored to balance. The sources are not perfectly uniform, and that uncertainty is important. Norse mythology survives in fragments, poems, later prose accounts, archaeological echoes, and medieval memory. Because of that, readers encounter both continuity and variation, but the broad emotional structure is clear. The world may burn, yet that does not mean the story of the world ends in emptiness. The myths hold open the possibility of continuation, however changed. This vision fits naturally with the rhythm of northern seasons. In landscapes where winter can dominate for long stretches, the return of light is not an abstract metaphor. It is a felt relief, something almost bodily. The old mythology transforms that experience into cosmic narrative. Darkness has power, but it does not last forever. Cold can become overwhelming, but it does not remain sovereign. The stories do not sentimentalize this cycle into simple comfort. Instead, they place it in a large and solemn frame, where the renewal of the world is always shadowed by the knowledge that loss will come again. That tension gives the mythology its depth. The same pattern of loss and restoration appears in smaller stories throughout the tradition. Thor loses his goats and gets them back, though only after a meal that shows how easily divine order can be strained by necessity and misunderstanding. Odin sacrifices an eye to gain wisdom, trading physical wholeness for deeper sight. Freyr gives up his sword in order to secure a marriage, and that choice later leaves him exposed when danger comes. These stories suggest a world where everything meaningful comes at a price. Power is not free, safety is not free, knowledge is not free. Even gain carries the shape of sacrifice inside it. Nothing is simply possessed without consequence. That economic sense of myth where gifts and costs are bound together is one of the reasons the tradition feels so serious and durable. The gods are not presented as all-powerful in a modern, absolute sense. They are powerful but limited. They are tied into the same web of obligation, fate, and consequence that affects mortals. This gives the stories a distinct emotional texture. The gods are larger than humans, yet they are not separate from the structure of existence. They live under pressure. They make choices with consequences. They inherit the cost of earlier acts. In that way, the myths are grand, but they are also close to everyday life. That is part of why they continue to feel intimate even when they describe cosmic events. They are stories of the sky and the sea, of giants and wolves, of fire and prophecy, but they are also stories about the terms on which life is lived. To live is to lose things. To gain things is to give up other things. To hold power is to know it may not last. Norse myth does not flatten those truths into moral lessons, but it does give them shape. It turns them into figures, journeys, battles, and endings that can be remembered. Those terms were preserved not only in stories of gods and doom, but in the quieter customs of daily devotion. People marked the passing of seasons. They made offerings. They sought favor before travel, farming, birth, battle, and winter. Some of these practices are known from textual sources, while others are inferred from archaeology, later folklore, and comparative evidence, so caution is always needed. Still, the general picture is clear enough. Religion was woven into the rhythms of ordinary life. People did not merely tell stories about divine powers. They tried to live in relation to them, to keep balance where balance was fragile, and to ask for protection in a world that could shift without warning. In that sense, the mythology was never only about distant gods or a far-off final battle. It was also about endurance, reciprocity, and attentiveness. It understood that life could be harsh without becoming meaningless. It understood that endings are real, but so are returns. Even in the shadow of Ragnarok, the old stories keep listening for the sound of what survives. The worship of the Norse gods was deeply tied to seasonal life, farming, travel, and family continuity. It was not usually something imagined as separate from everyday existence, set apart in a distant sphere of pure belief. Instead, devotion was woven into ordinary routines. The turning of the year, the keeping of animals, the launching of ships, the protection of children, and the honoring of those who had gone before. A household might feel the presence of the gods in very practical ways, in the hope of a good harvest, a safe winter, or a journey across rough water. Feasts and offerings helped reinforce those relationships, not as abstract symbols, but as living gestures of exchange and remembrance. Sacrifice or blot in the old Scandinavian context belonged to this devotional world. The word can encompass a wide range of offerings, rituals, and communal acts, and it is worth remembering that the evidence is uneven. Sometimes the sources suggest animals, sometimes food and drink, sometimes ceremonial sharing among a community. The details clearly varied by region, time, and circumstance. What matters most is the underlying idea that giving to the gods helped sustain balance between human life and larger divine or natural forces. It was not a transaction in a modern commercial sense, as though one could simply purchase favor. It was a relationship, shaped by gratitude, obligation, memory, and hope. Sacred groves, sites, and halls likely served as ritual spaces, though the archaeological record is often indirect and fragmentary. The Old North was not organized around huge temple systems in the way some later civilizations were. Instead, worship could be local, adaptable, and tied to places already meaningful to the people who lived there. A hall might become sacred because it was where a family gathered for ceremony. A grove might matter because it stood at the edge of settlement and seemed to belong partly to human beings and partly to the unseen world. This makes the religion feel rooted in landscape rather than in a single monumental center, as if holiness could settle in many places at once. Trees, springs, stones, and hills often held importance in Germanic religious practice. Norse mythology preserves that atmosphere by making the world itself feel responsive and alive. The ash tree Yggdrasil is the most famous example, but the feeling extends beyond one great symbol. A place can be holy because it has been remembered, because it has witnessed vows, or because power has been felt there over time. In that sense, the landscape becomes part of the religious mind. Wind moving through branches, water emerging from the earth, or mist gathering on a hillside could all encourage the sense that the world was fuller than it first appeared. Ancestor reverence probably also played an important role, though the textual evidence is incomplete and often indirect. In a society shaped by kinship, inheritance, and oral memory, the dead remain present through name, land, and story. They are not simply gone. They continue in the household's identity, in burial mounds, in inherited objects, and in the obligations carried by descendants. That fits neatly with Norse mythology's concern for lineage and fate. Many gods are linked to families, and many heroes are defined by ancestry. A person's place in the world was often understood through the chain of those who came before, and the stories themselves keep returning to that thread. Even the famous House of the Gods contains family strain within it. Odin, Thor, Freyja, Frigg, Loki, and others are not isolated powers, each standing alone in perfect clarity. They live amid relationship, tension, rivalry, affection, and obligation. Some are related by blood, some by marriage, some by oath, and some by necessity. The mythology understands that families can be sources of both strength and conflict. It does not hide that. Instead, it turns it into story. A divine household can be protective and dangerous at the same time, intimate and unstable, much like the human households that listened to these tales by firelight. The old festivals would have marked important moments in the year. Winter gatherings, harvest celebrations, and transitional rites likely gave communities ways to endure the dark season together. In a climate where cold, distance, and darkness could make life feel narrow, communal ritual offered warmth and continuity. The sources preserved in writing come mostly from later centuries, so they cannot show the whole living calendar in exact detail. Even so, the pattern is clear enough to imagine carefully. People met, drank, remembered, offered, and renewed their place in the year. These gatherings were practical as well as spiritual, binding neighbors into a shared rhythm that could carry them through hardship. Norse myth also contains many references to fate names, poetic formulas, and ritual language that suggest a culture attentive to speech. Spoken words could bless, curse, remember, or bind. Names were never merely labels. They carried history, character, and sometimes destiny. A vow spoken aloud could matter as much as a deed. A curse might linger. A praise formula might preserve honor long after the speaker had died. In that sense, language itself becomes a sacred instrument, capable of shaping reality not through force alone, but through voiced meaning. The old stories often treat speech as something powerful, delicate, and consequential. This emphasis on speech helps explain the survival of so many myths in poetic form. Poetry was not a luxury in the Old North. It was a vessel for cultural knowledge, memory, and often reverence. The skald's craft was therefore more than entertainment. It was a disciplined art, full of layered kennings, formal patterns, and preserved references that could carry inherited wisdom across generations. A poem could compress a whole world into a few lines. It could honor a ruler, mark a deed, recall a deity, or preserve a sacred name. The act of speaking poetry aloud gave that knowledge breath, and breath gave it continuity. Archaeology adds another layer through inscriptions, burial goods, amulets, and carved images. A hammer pendant, a rune stick, a ship burial, or a decorated stone can all speak to beliefs that are not fully visible in the literary texts. These objects often feel intimate. They suggest what people held close to the body, what they placed beside the dead, what they carved into wood or stone, and what they wanted to remember in material form. Together, these traces create a fuller but still partial picture. They do not explain everything, but they give texture to the silence left by time. They remind us that belief was once lived in hands, households, and ordinary materials. That partialness is important. Norse mythology should not be imagined as perfectly recoverable, as if every belief could be reconstructed with certainty from the surviving sources. It survives like a shoreline after tide and storm, reshaped, eroded, yet still recognizable. Some features stand out clearly. Others are blurred. Later writers, Christian scribes, regional variation, and the simple fragility of historical survival all affect what remains. The result is a tradition that is vivid and incomplete at once. That incompleteness is not a flaw to be corrected away. It is part of the story of how old worlds endure in fragments. One of the most beautiful things about studying it is that uncertainty does not reduce its value. It enhances the sense that we are listening across distance. We do not hear everything. We hear enough to feel the weight of the voice. There is a quiet dignity in that. The surviving myths, poems, and objects do not offer total clarity, but they do offer atmosphere, pattern, and human presence. They allow us to sense how people once ordered their world, how they feared and hoped, how they imagined the boundary between seen and unseen. In that way, uncertainty becomes a kind of humility, a reminder that the past is not owned, only approached. That voice carries into the heroic sagas as well, where kings, wanderers, women of wisdom, and doomed warriors move through a world of honor, memory, and often quiet sorrow. The stories do not always end happily, and they rarely pretend that life can be made safe by courage alone, but they do tend to end meaningfully. Someone keeps faith with a promise, someone names a loss, Someone faces fate without flinching, even when the outcome cannot be changed. These tales are not simply about conquest or survival. They are about bearing oneself with clarity inside a world that is often severe, beautiful, and brief. Meaning in Norse tradition is not a guarantee of comfort. It is a way of standing inside a difficult world and naming its shape. That may be one reason these stories still feel so resonant. They do not promise that suffering will vanish or that justice will always arrive on time. Instead, they suggest that dignity can still exist in the midst of uncertainty. A person can act with courage, loyalty, restraint, or wit, even while knowing that loss is part of the structure of life. The Old North did not always imagine victory as permanence. Sometimes it imagined honor as the truest form of endurance. That shaping continues in the very names of the gods, places, and forces that populate the old stories, many of which still echo through modern language and imagination. Some names have survived in the names of days, landscapes, and customs. Others linger in literature, scholarship, or popular culture, where they continue to gather new meanings. This survival is not just linguistic. It is cultural memory passing from one age to another, altered but not erased. The old stories remain alive partly because their names still carry a charge, a resonance that feels older than the page and wider than the moment. The legacy of Norse mythology is still visible in the modern world, even when people do not notice it at once. It lingers in ordinary speech, in calendar names, in place names, and in the faint assumptions that shape how people picture the northern past. The names of the days of the week in English preserve traces of old gods: Tuesday from Tyr, Wednesday from Odin or Woden, Thursday from Thor, and Friday from Frigg or Freyja, depending on linguistic history and interpretation. These are small survivals, easily overlooked, but they are not decorative. They are part of the daily rhythm of time itself. Every week, without fanfare, people repeat names that once belonged to a living sacred world. The gods have become so familiar in these forms that many speakers never pause to wonder where the words came from. Yet the words are quiet memorials, built into the most ordinary structures of life. Tyr himself is one of the more understated gods in modern popular culture, but in the older tradition his importance is significant. He is associated with law, honor, courage, and the binding force of oath and agreement. In some surviving evidence, he appears as a god of single-minded action, someone linked to order rather than spectacle. His most famous myth tells of Fenrir's binding, where the great wolf is restrained only when a pledge is given and then broken. Tyr places his hand in the wolf's mouth as a sign of good faith and loses it when the beast is trapped. It is a brief episode, but it carries a heavy emotional weight. The sacrifice is not loud, yet it is unforgettable. Tyr becomes a figure of trusted obligation and painful duty, the kind of god whose importance is measured less by triumph than by what he is willing to lose. That story also reveals something deeply characteristic about the Norse moral imagination. Promises are not abstract in these myths. They have substance, danger, and consequence. A vow can bind a god. An oath can expose a body to harm. Trust is not a gentle ideal but a serious risk. If a promise is made lightly, the world may answer with loss. This stern ethic helps explain why the myths often feel so sincere. Even when they are fantastical, they are grounded in a world where actions matter immediately. A person's word is not just speech. It is part of the structure of reality, and breaking it can unravel more than reputation. It can disturb the balance that holds communities together. Norse stories also continue to shape fantasy literature, games, films, and modern pagan practice. Their images have traveled far from the medieval North, and in doing so they have been adapted, simplified, and sometimes softened into symbols of heroic strength. But the originals remain deeper and stranger than many later retellings suggest. The modern image of a horned, helmeted Viking god is usually a later invention, not an accurate ancient one. In reality, the surviving evidence points to a much more varied visual culture. There were helmets, certainly, but also jewelry, carvings, textile patterns, ritual objects, wooden figures, and small personal items that carried meaning in quieter ways. The world of Norse religion was not standardized by modern branding. It was uneven, local, and shaped by craftsmanship as much as by story. That variety matters because it reminds us that the old faith was lived in daily objects, not only in dramatic scenes of battle. Modern scholarship has also changed how people read these myths. Earlier writers sometimes treated them as purely barbaric, as if they were only crude relics from a violent age. Others treated them as purely national, as though they belonged to a single modern identity and nothing else. Today, they are understood more carefully as part of a broader Northern European religious and literary world, shaped by exchange, migration, oral memory, and long contact across regions. The myths we know were preserved in manuscripts written down much later than the pagan age itself, and that distance invites caution. Some stories may have changed as they passed from mouth to memory to page. Some details may reflect Christian scribes, poetic convention, or local variation. That uncertainty does not weaken the myths. It makes them feel more human, more like a conversation carried across centuries, with voices overlapping in the dark. The gods themselves remain compelling because they are not perfect. Odin is wise, but also secretive and often difficult to trust. He seeks knowledge at a cost that can seem unsettling even by mythic standards. Thor is strong, dependable, and protective, yet not always subtle, and his force can be both comforting and blunt. Freyja is powerful and radiant, but also entangled with grief, longing, and the complicated weight of love. Loki is brilliant and inventive, but destructive in ways that can spread far beyond his own intentions. Frigg is associated with insight and domestic sovereignty, yet she cannot prevent every sorrow that comes to her house. Their imperfections make them recognizable. They are not remote ideals. They resemble the shape of real human strengths and failures, enlarged until they become divine. Even the afterlife in Norse myth reflects that complexity. It is not a single moral sorting machine, and it does not always divide the dead by a simple standard of good and evil. Different dead go to different places, and the destinations are shaped by kind of death, social memory, kinship, and divine association. Some are linked to Valhalla, some to Freyja's Hall, some to Hell, and some remain near the burial mound or within the remembered landscape of the living. The dead are not erased at once. They remain part of the world in altered form, through burial mounds, memorial stones, inherited names, and stories told by descendants. Death changes status, but it does not necessarily cancel belonging. A person can continue to matter through family lineages and local memory, as though the past still has weight in the earth. The old stories also preserve a strong sense of environment. They belong to sea roads, snowfields, dark timber, cold rivers, windswept coastlines, and halls warmed by fire. That setting matters as much as the plots. In these myths, the landscape is not just background. It is active, sometimes severe, and often intimate. People move through long winters across uncertain distances and under skies that can turn from pale to black in a short span. Fire inside a hall, for all its modesty, becomes more than comfort. It is survival, hospitality, and social order gathered into one glow. The climate of the myths is part of their meaning. Cold, darkness, and endurance are not accidental details. They shape the emotional texture of the stories and the kinds of virtues they praise. This is one reason Norse mythology is so suited to quiet late-night listening. It is full of long distance, shadowed boundaries, ancient tension, and patient endurance. Even when the stories are dramatic, they often feel as though they are being told by lamplight while the world outside sleeps. There is a kind of intimacy in that mood. The tale is not rushed. It unfolds beside embers in a low room, with the sense that the listener has time to imagine the dark beyond the doorway. The myths can contain sudden violence, but they are often surrounded by long stretches of waiting, traveling, remembering, and making sense of what has already happened. That spaciousness is soothing in its own quiet way. The more closely one listens, the more one notices that these myths are not only about battle and apocalypse, they are also about the fragile arrangements by which life continues. A tree is watered, a promise is made, a hall is built, a name is remembered, a god wanders, a raven returns. These are not grand gestures, yet they are the grammar of endurance. In mythic terms, the world survives through repeated acts of care and recognition. Someone tends the roots, someone keeps the fire, someone speaks the old words again. The stories understand that survival is often ordinary and that the ordinary can carry sacred weight when it is performed faithfully over time. And in that soft, difficult pattern, the Old North begins to feel less distant. It is not just a realm of axes and thunder and final battles. It is also a world of thresholds, household rhythms, remembered debts, and quiet perseverance. Its gods are powerful, but they are also bound to relationships. Its heroes are brave, but often at a price. Its dead are gone, yet still near. Its landscapes are cold, but not empty. The mythology endures because it can hold contradiction without collapsing. It can be stern and tender, severe and intimate, ancient and strangely immediate. Its stories are still here, moving quietly through language, ritual, memory, poetry, and imagination. They continue to offer wonder without asking for noise. They can be found in a weekday name, in a carved image, in a modern retelling, or in the older hush of a poem preserved against the odds. Even when the details are uncertain, the atmosphere remains vivid. The old stories invite attention but not urgency. They ask only to be heard in the calm. They do not need to announce themselves loudly in order to endure. So as this long, calm journey draws near its end, the myths remain exactly what they have been all along: stern, beautiful, uncertain, and alive in the dark.